being a catalyst, based on the way we've been talking about it, is really about having a mission, having a vision in your, whether it's your eyes, your head, your heart, whatever speaks to you, having that vision, and then being good at telling the story and showing up and serving other people who share your vision, building trust with them and building a common sense of purpose. And you don't need to have, gone to Stanford or have a PhD to do those things.
Hi, I'm Tracy Lovejoy.
And I'm Shannon Lucas. We are the co-CEOs of Catalyst Constellations, which is dedicated to empowering catalysts to create bold, powerful change in the world.
This is our podcast, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, where we speak with Catalyst executives about ways to successfully lead transformation in large organizations.
I'm thrilled today to have Dr. Ritu Kapur, who's the head of Digital Biomarkers at Verily Life Sciences, an Alphabet company focused on precision health. She's responsible for Verily's precision measures strategy for sensor data and leads a team of over 80 scientists, engineer, and operations professionals. She's a neuroscientist with over 20 years of experience in evidence generation, medical device development, neuromodulation, and signal processing. Her focus is on using traditional and machine learning methods to extract clinically relevant information from implanted and wearable sensors and making these technologies available to serve the needs of people living with disease. She's also a visiting full professor by special appointment at the Radboud University Medical Center Department of Neurology. It's so lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And I just have to say, because you show up with an incredible humility that everyone just got to hear your insane, background, and you're like, I don't know if I qualify. And that's such an interesting thing that so many catalysts sort of share with us. So I would love to understand in your words, how do you relate to the concept of catalyst, and maybe what has that meant for you in different leadership roles?
Yeah, so, there are sort of two aspects to this. And one of the aspects, and I think one of the fundamental aspects, is actually has nothing to do with like where you went to school or what your major was, or even how well you do on things like standardized tests, right? Being a catalyst, based on the way we've been talking about it, is really about having a mission, having a vision in your, whether it's your eyes, your head, your heart, whatever speaks to you, having that vision, and then being good at telling the story and showing up and serving other people who share your vision, building trust with them and building a common sense of purpose. And you don't need to have, gone to Stanford or have a PhD to do those things, right? So there's that definition. And then on the other side of the coin, the way that being a catalyst speaks to me that is more about my background is, I'm a scientist. I've fallen in love with science, despite a career that was early. I had earlier planned on being a lawyer. So I fell in love with neuroscience and with the art of what is in front of us. What are the frontiers? What does our biology tell us about what it means to be human? And how can we help people living with disease, for example, to live better lives? And so when you are a scientist, your job is kind of to discover new things. And you can discover those things and just sort of say, oh, I discovered something that's for me to know, and maybe I'll write it up in this paper. Or you can say, I really want to discover new things in the service of helping people, for example, with Parkinson's disease, which is where I've spent a fair amount of my time, as well as on epilepsy. And so if you're trying to both discover new things and help people at scale, especially, then you need to convince a lot of people along the way that you guys should work together on this. Because you just having a vision without having trust with other people who are also working on that mission too, you're not going to be able to affect change. You're not going to be able to do it. So it's bringing people on.
I love all of the things. There's so many threads I already want to pull on. Can you talk a little bit about the neuroscience about bringing people, maybe the lived experience as a catalyst,
Sure.
but also the bringing people along part? Because there's a lot of science behind how we might be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think you first of all have to know yourself, right? So there are ways that I do this in the world that are not going to work for people with different personalities, right? So, maybe you're a little more introverted and you do better building your relationships and building trust one-on-one. Maybe you're more of a show up and take charge of a room and you've got the charisma and you can, have everybody hanging on every word. And it's you don't have to be one or the other, right? There are different ways to connect with other people. And one of my best friends from grad school, actually, she's a Southern gal, and we'll have all kinds of conversations about her job, my job, and at the end we're always like, dang, it's just people. Everything is just people, right? So in terms of the biology of that, we're wired to connect with other people. Now, some people need more of that, some people need less, and so being in tune with what you need to do, and then how are you going to do that in a sustainable way to build trust among the other people in your organization, and not just pushing your ideas out, but understanding what other people who share your purpose and your mission, what's important to them, what are they trying to get done, and being somebody who can help them get done what they want to get done in service of the larger mission. That's how you build trust, right?
100%. So important. And just one more double click on your definition of catalyst, because when we were talking before we hit record, you were like, there's kind of a double-edged sword about having the purpose of a catalyst. And I'm wondering if you can just speak to, like, it can drive us, but then it can drive us.
Yeah. So I think what I said was, wow, sometimes I wish I didn't care so much, right?
Exactly
And so
right.
on the one hand, I have a gift, I think, that not everyone gets to have in the world, which is I have a sense of meaning and purpose, right? I'm here to help people living with neurological disease live better lives. I probably hold myself to an impossible standard, which is I want to be part of the machine that comes up with a cure for some of these diseases or a treatment. Maybe that's aiming too high, but somebody's got to do it, right? I remember my cousin once was talking to me, and I was stressed about work, and I was working in epilepsy at the time, and he's like, Ritu, you don't have to cure epilepsy. And I said, but if I'm not going to, who's going to do it, right?
Yeah.
So that's one side of the coin. And it is perhaps a little egotistical, but also really great fuel, right? To use that and to have that sense of purpose. And the other side of the coin, in addition to making sure you're taking care of your physical self, your mental health, your ability to connect spiritually in whatever way, whatever that means for you, with your family and your friends, those are all incredibly important parts of the picture. There's also there's a skill here, and I used to take these meditation courses, mindfulness-based stress reduction. I'm a big fan of those courses. So if anybody's feeling burned out, highly recommend checking those out by John Kabat-Zinn. There is a skill in when to push forward and when to pull back, and you have to, even in the most tense or intense of situations, you have to learn how to do that. And you do it in corporate settings, you do it in personal settings. And look, I don't always get it right, but it is something I'm getting better at over time. And your ability to listen and read when it is time to push versus when it is time to step back and let things flow. I think that's what takes you from being like a young whippersnapper who's got a lot of potential to being a really skilled leader. And so you have to give yourself time to cultivate.
It's so powerful, and something, I mean, we talk about in the book, and we talk a lot about with the catalyst that we work with, but I think it's so foundational, because we're going to encounter resistance. Like, that is a given as a change agent, but that knowing, and for me, it's kind of a spiritual thing. Like, I don't know where that comes from. Sometimes that, like, letting go just a little bit is the thing that, like, unblocks it.
Exactly.
I'm wondering if you can connect this or not, to sort of, like, maybe share one or two of the challenges that you've faced throughout your career when trying to drive transformation. And also, like, there's this large org thing that can add complexity to it. Like, is there something that stuck out as a hurdle for you in your role as a catalyst leader?
Sure. There are things that are internal to the company, but there's also a larger landscape here on which we're operating when it comes to digital measures, specifically in some novel neurotech, machine learning based, types of things. And that is that in order for these things to be successful, right? Success is defined in many different ways. There's, can we detect biological signals that matter, that reflect changes in a patient's quality of life, such that you might want to use a digital measure for making a decision about whether or not to approve a drug or therapy or reimburse it, right? So that's the top line. And an example of this is, we all kind of know what it looks like when people aren't doing well. So I'll switch maybe a little out of neurology into like heart failure or heart disease. When you see someone who can't really walk without stopping, so they're taking a couple steps, they're moving very slow, they're panting, et cetera. We all understand that their quality of life is impacted by some portion of their health. We all also are like, you can probably measure how somebody's walking and how often they have to stop, right? So all of these things make a lot of sense. And every human being who shows up is like, yeah, of course, that makes sense. So even with something that's not like a black box like that, right? Taking those digital measures and getting them used for regulatory or reimbursement decision making is how a company succeeds, right? So a company has to have a business model, right? So that needs to happen. Now, again, everybody's like, okay, yes, let's do this. Then you have to bring in the people making the decisions, the regulatory and reimbursement decisions, right? And I know these people. I've talked to people at FDA, for example, and all of these technologies are new. They are trying their best to figure out, okay, well, how do we come up with ways of developing policy around this that are going to meet our needs to, make sure things are safe and effective and safeguard things, right? So they want to do it, we want to do it, the patients want it, but it's still very hard to come together because it's not clear, where the handoff happens, what the rules should be. We don't have the right venues. And so you have all of these things happening, and then they happen in a slow fashion. And then what happens is the small companies can't stay alive long enough for any of these cycles to be complete and this alignment to be achieved, right? So there's this really complex environment around getting new things done, even though people in general are on the same page about wanting to do it. So that's probably like one of the main challenges that I face right now in the current role of developing new measures. That again, I think all the stakeholders are willing. It's just a matter of how are we going to come together and do this.
It's such a fascinating example. So we have this thing called the Catalyst Leadership Trust. And a year and a half ago, we did a research report on business level or industry level business co-creation, right? I mean, there's this, if we're going to focus on some of the most intractable, biggest problems to solve, to your point, like a small startup in Silicon Valley is not going to be able to do that by themselves. And so the complexity, I think, for a lot of catalysts, even if it's not quite at that industry level, like the complexity of co-creation and bringing external multiple stakeholders along on the journey is real. If maybe you have an answer or a solution to that, or maybe if you could wave your magic wand, like what would be a way to, make that experience, I guess, more effective?
Yeah, I think it's really about venues. Look, we have to, especially in healthcare, we have to be very mindful of when and how we interact with agencies that regulate us and agencies that make decisions about reimbursement, right? There, you can't be, throwing back cocktails and going to parties together, right? Like that's not the appropriate way of interacting. Although some of these people are lovely and I would love to have cocktails with them, but that's not what we do. So then the question becomes, okay, what are the venues for interaction? Because we need to have the conversation about, okay, what is the evidence you need? Should it look this way or that way, right? And educating them about, well, here's some new techniques that we're using because we're supposed to be and are on the cutting edge of what's being done technically. There's no way they can know that. I mean, my goodness. So the challenge is there are venues for having that conversation only for things that already exist and have existed for a long time. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would create a venue that is not just, oh, you have to know this person, you have to show up at the right conference where they're going to be there and make sure that you catch them at the coffee break, or you have to get invited to this endpoints roundtable, right? So there would just be a venue and there would be a place to say, okay, in Parkinson's disease, this is a little naive, but in Parkinson's disease, here are the people who get to decide what counts as good enough, what counts as good evidence, scientific, academic, those, and then they have a standing meeting. And if you're trying to build something, you can run it by them and they'll give you the check mark and then you can go do the engineering, right? Now that's a very, it's a concrete example, but it's a naive view, right? Like that's not going to happen. We don't have endless time and resources from all of these folks. So then, yeah, that's the question of like, how do we make sure that those venues exist so that the exchanges are happening fast enough that we can create good industry around it?
Yeah, it's fascinating because it also comes back to something you said earlier, which is like it's all personal,
It's
right?
people.
It's
Yeah.
like the intersection of the people, the different people with their different disciplines and domains and experience. I'm wondering if you have examples about how you, as a catalyst leader in the complexity of this environment, have brought people along, especially because you guys are always on the cutting edge. So I'm guessing there's a lot of education that's
Yeah.
happening as you're trying to co-create.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so bringing people along, I think there are a couple components. One is being clear about what you're bringing them along on, right? What is this journey? And again, these are all things that I can talk about in theory, and sometimes I'm good at it, and sometimes I'm still learning, right? Of course. But being clear on, hey, you know, people who have to drive halfway across the country or drive for several hours, find parking in a city that they don't live in, and then come visit the doctor are likely going to be physiologically stressed out, and therefore the exam you give them, their exam for Parkinson's disease, might not be reflective of what life is like for them day to day. And
Right.
so, because of that, we want to make sure that people can monitor how people's Parkinson's is. So we're going to build a virtual motor exam that lets somebody take one of these exams at home, right? So setting the context for like, why are we doing this? Why would it matter? And then figuring out, okay, then how do you link that to what does clinical validity look like? What does the market opportunity look like? What does the technical feasibility look like? So starting with a common story, I think really helps.
Storytelling. I've heard you mention that a couple of times, which I think is super powerful. Moving on, imagine that you had the maybe a little bit more inward focused in this organization or previous organization. If you could instantly get any support or resource for yourself as a catalyst leader to expedite the things that you're working on, what would that support look like?
Mhm. I think it is just more time
Mm,
from individuals, right? So we have a lot of, so there are two components here, which I think are going to be familiar to many listeners, right? It is this concept of a matrixed organization. So I don't think there's a perfect way to structure it. I've thought about org structure a lot. I actually did a brief stint working in HR at Google in 2009, 2010, which was really illustrative for me. But it's like, okay, do you organize around product so that, everybody working on this virtual motor exam for Parkinson's disease or on digital measures, we are all an organization, everything rolls up through one person. It is all one thing. Or do you have a more matrix approach where all of our hardware engineers have a lead and all of our software have a lead and all the data, right? And then that goes. So you can see the strengths and weaknesses of both, right? So if you just have one person kind of at the top of a pyramid, everything I think moves more quickly. However, that person can't possibly be the best hardware engineer in the world, the most cutting edge data scientist, have deep clinical experience, right? That's not really possible. So you sacrifice a little bit of the expertise piece for speed. The other confirmation is slower, it's much more confusing, but people get a lot better training in their discipline. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would come up with some like fifth dimensional org structure that solves for both of those things. I'd be magic.
Yeah, I want that thing too. And then just sprinkle in a little bit of extra time. I mean, I just
Okay.
gave a talk a couple weeks ago about doing more with less. And I think that narrative in most organizations is really loud right now, right? It's like, and so everyone is talking about the tyranny of the urgent and the workload while we're still dealing with change fatigue and the need to transform.
I don't love the concept of doing more with less. I think that that is one of those things where when I hear that, I'm like, oh, come on, man, right? Like, do less with less, but do the right things. Do the top two things. Don't do 50 things because you're scared. And I think this preserving of optionality
Yeah.
is it's almost like we were talking about having the story and the vision. It's like if you can tell a huge story, but can only do like the first part of that story, people get scared and they're like, well, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this and this. And then they make 1% progress on 100 things instead of making 100% progress on one thing. And so I think for really creative people, for people who have big thoughts, big visions, that's a really hard balance to strike. You have to actually make progress because at least in the business world, you're going to get cut, right? So that's a really tough thing to navigate too.
How do you navigate that? I mean, it's so
Yeah,
tough because you'll have like your 5 year, 10 year, you're like, I
yeah,
want to cure Parkinson's. Like that's
yeah,
not going to
yeah.
happen overnight. So how do you navigate that?
I think there's a balance, right? And also this starts to come to the team, right? Of like, well, you want there to be some bottoms up energy, but you can't be like, yeah, sure, let's have 1,000 different projects, right? And this is something that at very innovative organizations, when you try to shift from being a moonshot factory where anyone can think of anything and get a little bit of funding to start it, how do you actually have that have impact at scale in healthcare? You have to get super focused really fast, and you got to do a lot of stuff that some of the innovators think is kind of boring in the middle. Although my colleagues who work in those middles, but like quality, regulatory, like the people who write the SOPs, the operations people, they don't think it's boring. So that's the one thing that I can advise is like make sure you have strong relationships with those partners so that they understand what your overarching goal is and can help you figure out how to do it right instead of excluding them because they're just going to tell you a bunch of stuff you don't want to hear because it's not the kind of stuff you like to do. Right? Like that's an error that I see over and over. Instead of being like, let me get to know you, head of quality, head of regulatory, or whatever the right person is for the role that you're in. Sorry, I lost my.
I was, yeah, the question was like, how do you navigate that? Because you have to demonstrate impact and you have this big vision and people lose focus and yeah.
I'm just like, we can talk about everything. So I think there's a generative phase where you say, okay, here just everybody write down everything you want to do. And I'm like, all right, we got to pick 3.
Yes.
Everyone's like, oh, but we could do this and this and this. And that's where I can be maybe a little draconian where I'm like, no, we're not going to do that. Right. Because now as I've become more senior, I am responsible for making it clear to executives that our teams have made progress. And if I can't show that because I have to talk about 100 different projects, they're going to get cut. Right. And I'm like, this is my responsibility to you is to hold us accountable for being clear about here are the top 2 to 3 things we're going to deliver and then showing up, not just delivering them, but maybe going a little bit beyond expectations, right?
Yeah.
That's how you win that. And then those ideas are there. It's not like we kill it, we never talk about it.
That's right. We have a thing we call the not right now list because catalysts will overwhelm themselves with all of their ideas, let alone other people who are non-catalysts. 2 key takeaways that I heard from that, and then I'll move on to the next one is I loved the sort of find the supporters. Like, I've been really lucky to find people in legal and procurement and regulatory or whatever who aren't catalysts, but they're like the number 2, they can understand and support some of the things that are on the like cutting edge there. And then the second one actually is building on what you said, which is the discipline to kill things too. Like I had a mentor years ago and I was squarely in innovation and it was like such a mind expanding moment. And it sounds so easy, it sounds like common sense. Of course you have to kill things. To do more with less doesn't actually really work, on the infinite scale. So yeah, we have to get the discipline to make the hard decisions at the beginning and kill things.
Yeah. And set the expectation beforehand because I think it's really demoralizing for teams when they think they're working on something that's going to go forward and it gets killed, right? I've had to do this a couple times in the last couple of years, and it made it clear to me that we have to be clear about when things are going to be reevaluated and give people a chance to cross that finish line, but then say, hey, there's going to be a checkpoint here. There's going to be a good window. And so everybody has the right amount of emotional investment.
100%. Yeah, expectation setting is something I talk about in almost every meeting of work that we do. It's like the thing. Because you can design to anything, right? All right. So in your view, have you had other catalyst leaders, or friends or whatever in your life? And maybe how has that impacted you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 2 categories here. So one is other people who are catalysts, and the other, I do want to touch back on something you just summarized, which was, finding the people in like legal and regulatory and quality, et cetera. And the thing that I can't talk about those people enough, right? Because again, to do anything at scale, to do anything real, you're going to need those people. And it is important to understand and hire the right people for those roles. Now I'm speaking as maybe a little bit more senior leadership here, but you need people in those roles who understand the playbook, but understand when there isn't a playbook written already.
Yes.
How to work with you to make sure that you're not like, well, there's no playbook, we're just not going to involve you. You can't do that, right? You have to say like, okay, we're trying to do this new thing. Given your deep expertise in all the rules and regs, how should we do this so that when we are audited or when someone comes and says, hey, how did you do this? We have a way of showing up that we can still be proud of and stand behind, right? So it actually doesn't work very well if the people who are in leadership roles in those functions, if you're a catalyst and you're working with someone who's leading those groups and they only run already written playbooks, that's going to be a tough sell, right? That is where I've seen in the past there have been challenges. Fortunately, I always joke about how people make jokes about lawyers and they're like always mean about lawyers, but I'm like, I love our legal team, right? They're
Totally.
and they don't let me get away with anything, but I'll be like, okay, here's what's going on. They're like, well, you can't do that, but we could do it this way. And then this, if we did this, I'm like, oh yeah, that'd be easy, right? So we have a way of working together so that we're showing up well. So that's the support for catalysts, I would say.
Yes.
The other catalyst support is like, it's just really validating, right? Because I feel like a lot of the challenge for me is my fuel, right? Like, how much fuel do I have? Am I burning too much too quickly? It's rarely the case that I'm not burning enough fuel. Like, I tend to overburn, right? So what we're talking about. And so talking to other catalysts is incredibly validating. I'll give you an example, which is around, it sounds so basic, right? Working to get we have a smartwatch that we make, and we're getting it on people in clinical trials. And you would think, because there's like the Fitbit and the Apple Watch and all this kind of stuff, like no big deal, right? You should be able to do that pretty easily. But because of the way we were using the device, we're collecting broad data, all these innovative new measures, we're doing machine learning, like we're doing all this cool stuff, right? It's being deployed as more of like a medical device than a consumer device, right? So this was a situation we're in. And we were trying to get these watches on wrists in like 60 or 70 different countries. Again, you think, oh, this is a logistics problem. Absolutely not. It is so hard trying, because every country has different rules and regulations about what counts as a medical device, who the competent authorities are, what their adjudication is of what you're measuring in the study. And they all have their own timelines, and some of them only meet like once every 2 or 3 months, right? And I remember we were going through this as we were going through some of our growing pains. And I was like, how can it be this hard to, am I a dummy? How can it be this hard to get watches on the wrist? This is a very low risk device. It's not stimulating. It's not doing anything. And then I met someone from another company who was on the drug developer side of this. And we were at a conference and we were having dinner, and we spent an hour talking about how incredibly hard this is. And I was like, this is a brilliant woman. She has an incredible background. She used to work at FDA. If she thinks this is hard, it just kind of helped me ease back a little and say, this is not because you're not working hard enough. This is because this is a complex problem. And then it shifts, because then the goal, the way you deal with that is not to charge at it harder. The way is to say, okay, what do I not understand about how the system works? Who can I recruit to help me unpack this? And so it kind of shifts. It shifted the way that I approach that problem.
Yes. It's like the frictionless. We talk about this a lot. Like in our class, the skills improve every single time. But the number one thing that people say that they loved about it was being in community with other catalysts. And to what you're saying, it's often like, it's not that you're not dreaming big enough, right? Because like sometimes we're told we have to, do this. And it's like, yes, I can see your vision. Your vision is the right vision. And this is hard. And like, that can just be enough to be like, oh, understood and frictionless. Totally. It's so powerful. And the fuel, I mean, the fuel is just, and that's why I love my work, because I get to hang out with people like you and get the fuel. So awesome.
Yeah.
All right. If you had some pieces of advice, maybe for your 20-year-old self or up and coming catalysts, particularly those working in large organizations, what would you tell them?
It's not all about you. And that's not meant to shame anybody, right? I think a lot of times catalysts have like maybe a big personality or maybe a little more right? There is that tendency, but that is not a sit down and be quiet piece of advice. That is if you're going to really do something big, it's going to be bigger than anything even the most brilliant person in the world can do themselves. And it shifts as you mature from being like, I'm a bright spark, look at me, I can do this, you can trust me with that, to saying, if we're fighting a battle against, for me, neurodegenerative disease, which I can pronounce, if we're fighting a battle, it's one thing when you're like, I'm the strongest soldier on the field, and it's another when you're like, okay, do I have an army? Are they well fed? Are they well rested? Where are we fighting this battle? Do we have the upper ground? Like, can we flank people? Right. So your thinking shifts from being about you to being about what your team can do. And that is a real, um, and especially, and I'm going to add some intersectionality here. I think for women, sometimes there's this concern, like, especially in technical fields, like, am I getting credit for the technicality of my work? You know, so you have to show up and be like, I did this, and be very vocal about what you've done. And then you shift into it's not about you, it's about your team and what they can do. And the way that you show up is to be in meetings and speak kind words, accurate, but kind words about what other people have done. And that can feel a little scary when, as a younger woman, at least I was always told, especially in technical fields, like, you got to be out there, you got to be aggressive, or everyone's going to think the guys did all the coding and whatever. So then it starts to shift. And that's something you have to let yourself get comfortable with, right? And say, I don't have to be in the front. People will still know what my contribution is, but then you have to, and that's why the picking 2 things instead of 100 is important, right? Because if I picked 100 things, it would be very hard to see my contributions. But if my team is nailing their top 2 things every quarter, year after year, it becomes clear, right? So building that space for yourself is important.
Thanks for sharing the intersectionality of that. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is the sort of emotional labor. Like, as you're thinking about all of the Army, there's sort of this emotional labor because you really are thinking about the well-being and all of those people that you have to bring. How do you maintain your energy doing that? Like, that's a big energy outlay.
It is. I'm still learning on this one, right? And one of the things I've been learning a lot about this last year is I have mama bear mode, apparently, that I get into that actually I don't need to get into. So it depends on the seniority of the people that I'm leading. There was a time a couple years ago when mama bear mode, like, don't mess with my team, was a little more of what was required. And now I have to trust that the people that I hired and have been working with have blossomed themselves, and they themselves are leaders, right? So it's not like I'm mentoring somebody who's just out of college. It's like, this person has 10, 15 years of experience in the workplace themselves. I need to step back and let them lead and let them stand up for what they need to do. And it is hard, not because I don't think they're capable, but because emotionally I feel like sometimes, well, this is my team, I have to protect them, I have to go to bat for them. And sometimes it's kind of like, no, I can go to bat for myself. So that's still something I'm learning as I get more senior and my team gets more senior. That's still a place where I'm having to learn.
Thank you. On a personal note, for me, as the reminder, because the tendency for a lot of catalysts is the overfunctioning for other people.
Yes.
Which doesn't allow them to grow either. So, like, allowing the space for the growth of the rest of the people around you is super important. Thank you for that reminder. All right. Final fun piece as we wrap. I'd love to hear about your favorite catalyst, past or present, who inspires you and why? Why do they stand out to you?
I was thinking about this question, and I was like, oh, I should have like a healthcare or a scientist and whatever. But I was thinking about who I have been thinking about in this way recently. And we were just chatting about this before we started recording. You're like, it's fine if it's Beyonce. And it's Beyonce. And I'm going to tell you why.
My car is named after her, Ritu, just so you know.
Amazing. Amazing. Yes. I was like, should it be Taylor or should it be Beyonce? And, I identify strongly with, singers, first of all, and let's be real, like, I was in my all women's a cappella group in college, so I was nowhere near, whatever these
We're not all Beyonce, yeah.
We're not all Beyonce, but I have like a little sparkle of that in me. And one of the things that's happening right now that I really love harkens back to something I mentioned before, which is, I'm Indian. We came to America when I was about 4 years old, but I grew up in Texas. And from a musical standpoint, I've actually loved a lot of bluegrass and some country, like the bluegrass country intersection, for a long time. But I felt maybe a little excluded from it because it was like, this music is not for you. So I see what's going on right now with this new album that she's got out. It's very controversial, right? Oh, country, and can she claim it? Is it her genre? Is she allowed? Is she not? But I love that she's like, I also grew up in Houston. So, she's from Houston as well. And I love that there's this reclamation of this thing that was not supposed to be for a certain set of people. And now saying this is for everybody, right? And so that is real change. And she's getting a lot of blowback. I mean, this is very of the moment, right? She's getting a lot of blowback for it. But, you know, when I thought about like, okay, well, how is she doing this? My answer is not great. I'm like, well, I can't say like, oh, catalysts out there, just be Beyonce and then you can do whatever you want. But I do think there's a little bit of just pretending you're Beyonce that needs to happen, right? When you show up in these difficult situations without being condescending to other people, without excluding other people, without thinking you're better than everyone, just showing up and inhabiting your space with charisma and warmth and radiating that out. If you can visualize that a little bit, I think that helps. So it's my hope for
Chills in my body, Ritu, tears in my eyes. Like, what an incredible place to end our conversation, because that is so powerful. Thank you for this amazing, amazing conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a delight speaking with you.
Likewise.
Yeah.
And to our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about how to accelerate positive change, go to the website, catalystconstellations.com. Of course, check out the book, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burnout. And if you're still tuning in and if you joined the episode, please take 10 seconds to rate it on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcast. We'd love for you to share it with other catalysts in your life. Thanks again for joining us.